Okay, hello everybody. Welcome back to the next segment of our Distinguished Speaker Series. It is my pleasure today to welcome Dr. Jennifer Tackett as our speaker today. Dr. Tackett is a professor of psychology at Northwestern University, most recently, very recently promoted to professor, which is, yay, congratulations. She's also the director of clinical training at Northwestern. She runs the Personality Cross Development Lab and is the co-director of the Illinois Twins Project, which is a big project. I don't think she's going to talk about that today, but that'll be for a different time. She has a PhD in clinical psychology from the University of Minnesota, which is still today and has been for a long time regarded as the best clinical psychology program in the world. Prior to that, she has degrees from the Texas Academy of Math and Science and at Texas A&M University. She's from Texas, for those of you from the Texas area. She was a professor at the University of Toronto and the University of Houston, both prior to taking her position at Northwestern. She's the editor an associate editor at several journals. In fact, we were just talking about this. She's been the associate editor at 12 different journals, currently just at 4, Collabora, Advances in Methods and Practices in Psychological Science, and also in the Journal of Abnormal Psychology. I shouldn't have been surprised, but I was surprised. I was counting, and it really took me a long time. I was counting her number of publications. She has more than 100 publications on the topics of personality development, clinical disorders, behavioral genetics, statistics, and most recently she started to do work on leadership emergence and development, particularly in adolescence, a topic of which she'll be talking about with us today. She has more than 4,500 citations of her work on these topics, and her H-index is 37, and as you all know, I like to point out how much better everyone is than I am, who we bring here, and mine is like 20. And hers is like almost double mine, which is, these are exponentially growing numbers, so it's like, basically means she's like 10 times better than me. Okay, one paper that she published just 2 years ago has already been cited more than 400 times. So I hope it goes without saying that Jennifer is one of the most impressive personality psychologists in the world, and we're really happy to have her today. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Tackett.
Thank you. Thank you all so much for inviting me here and giving me your time and attention. I'm really excited to talk about this work with you all and very intimidated. This is a very new area for me and you're literally the experts, so please feel free to interrupt me, ask questions, offer suggestions. I'm really ready to get some feedback on this new line of research. So as Ryan said, I've been developing a line of research on adolescent leadership for 4 or 5 years now, and this is the first time I'm starting to kind of present this work, which is very exciting. And so to start talking about kind of an unorthodox topic, I'm going to start in a somewhat unorthodox way. I hope you'll indulge me for a minute here. If I can get my thing to work. Guess I did need a clicker.
It's not working? We tested this before.
It's like broken or something. Oh my goodness. Let's just try this again and see what happens. All right. Hopefully this will work. So a little bit of an unusual talk, or beginning of an academic talk. So I thought I would start by offering a brief history and answering a question that I've been asked a lot over the last 3 or 4 years, which is, how does a child clinical psychologist come to study the topic of leadership, aka, Jennifer, what are you doing again and why? Does it make any sense? So how did this come to be? As a child clinical psychologist, my clinical expertise is in externalizing disorders. So I primarily have studied topics like aggression and delinquency in children and adolescents. I am also a personality psychologist and always have been, so I primarily focus on personality traits related to child externalizing disorders. So I would kind of cover this space by defining personality traits related to getting along, getting ahead, keeping it under control. These are not new concepts to anyone in this room. In a big 5 terminology, we might think of agreeableness, the social dominance aspects of extroversion and conscientiousness is kind of falling in this space. So I built my entire career in this area. And about a decade ago, I started incorporating hormones into my research. I was interested in hormonal biomarkers of all of these characteristics. And one of the very first things I looked at was testosterone. And what I thought would be a very easy question to start with, which is just looking at the association between testosterone and aggression in the kids I study. It seems a pretty obvious hypothesis to test, and we have a lot of experimental evidence and animal research suggesting that higher levels of testosterone are linked with higher levels of aggression. This isn't a complicated idea, but when you actually look at the literature, there's very little evidence for this association in humans. It's quite a puzzle. So meta-analytic effect sizes put the association at around 0.15, and that's not accounting for publication bias. So there's not good evidence that these are linked in humans, which I found an interesting puzzle. As a personality psychologist, I thought, I wonder if personality might matter when we're looking for this link. So the very first question I asked in this research line was whether these personality traits that we know are related to externalizing problems might actually moderate the association between testosterone and aggression. So in other words, do personality traits related to self-control or self-regulation moderate the extent to which we see higher levels of testosterone linked to higher levels of aggression? So a very straightforward hypothesis that I tested in one of my adolescent samples and found this really beautiful interaction, great support for my hypothesis. So here we're looking at the self-regulatory personality traits of agreeableness and conscientiousness, and we find that when we include self-regulation or self-regulatory personality as a moderator, we find really nice evidence for this testosterone externalizing disorder association. So higher testosterone, higher aggression or externalizing, but only for our youth who were low in self-regulation, right? For the poorly regulated kids who are high in testosterone, you find that link. So that was great, that was lovely, but in addition to finding support for my hypothesis, there was something else that I found really interesting. So what I hadn't hypothesized was that the high testosterone kids who were high in self-control or high in self-regulation were actually at really adaptive levels of functioning. Right? So they were more adaptive than average, and that wasn't something I expected to find. So I found it really interesting, and right away I started thinking about why that might be. Initially I was interested in it from a clinical perspective, because if we think about high testosterone as a biomarker or risk factor for these problems I study, well, wouldn't we also want to know why sometimes that risk factor is kind of channeled in more adaptive ways, what that might look like from a prevention or intervention perspective. So I started really trying to think about who these kids were, right? So who are high testosterone, high self-control kids who aren't just doing okay, they're actually flourishing, right? They're succeeding. So of course I immediately turned to the idea of leadership, where you start envisioning, oh, maybe this is the captain of the basketball team or the student council president, or let's think about some of these higher testosterone kids who have it under control and are using that in really successful adaptive ways. So that's how all of this really started, and a research program from this very simple finding was born. As I started thinking about adolescent leadership or youth leadership, my very next step was to turn to the literature. Initially, I just thought, I'll go see what we already know. I'll go find some measures people are using. I'll add them into the studies I'm already doing. I'll kind of find out what we already know about this area, and very quickly found that we know nothing, that there's basically not an existing literature on leadership early in life. So that was even more exciting. So that's why I'm here. I'm going to talk just really briefly about where I'm at in sort of developing a theoretical framework for early leadership, because there isn't a literature to draw from. I'm really kind of starting from scratch and thinking about what this research program might look like. So I'll kind of highlight where I'm at with that, which is a more qualitative approach to this question. But then I want to spend a little more of my time talking about data we've been collecting in my lab for 4 years now. So we started collecting data very quickly to try and start mapping this landscape, given that there's nothing out there. And I'll talk a little bit about the data we've been collecting, show some preliminary findings, and hopefully get feedback and ideas, because we're really at a point where we want to know kind of what to look at next and what might be interesting to do here. So as I said, the first step as a scientist was, okay, I'm going to go to the literature and see what we already know, and there was none. I spent a lot of time talking to my friends in business schools and social psychologists who study these things, asking people, who's doing this? Like, where do I go? I want to study where leadership comes from before adulthood. And over again, people said, I don't know anyone who's doing that. I don't know of a literature on that. You should do that. That seems important. So how do you do that? Well, the approach I've been taking is to sort of try and marry these two existing literature. So of course, there's a very extensive leadership science literature, but it's really entirely on adults. And a lot of it is even on, MBA students, like pretty selective, like empirical studies that are done with pretty selective adult populations. There's, of course, also very extensive literature on development, on adolescent development in particular. And the developmental literature does not study anything like leadership. They study a lot of things that are relevant for leadership, but there's really no research on this idea in the developmental literature either. So I've been working with these two literatures in parallel, trying to kind of bring them together into this framework, despite the fact that these literatures are completely ignorant of one another. I think it's pretty obvious that leadership, of course, emerges very early in life. It seems pretty intuitive. I haven't run into people who don't agree with this, don't like this idea. And in fact, as I've spent the last few years talking to people, not just researchers, not just leadership researchers, but I've been going into schools and talking with principals and teachers. I've been going to nonprofits that work on youth development. I've been going to high schoolers themselves. Everyone is interested in this idea. I have yet to go into a high school where there is not some kind of leadership development program already happening. They all have them. It's fascinating. And it's the same thing at the nonprofits I've talked with. And then I say, that's so cool that you're doing this. You have this leadership development program. Can I see your protocol? What does it look like? What is it based on? And they just make it up, right? Like it's all made up because there is no literature. They say, oh, well, maybe there's a little bit of, let's teach them grit and like, let's throw in some growth mindset or, who knows? They're making it up, which is fine. But they clearly think it's important. People are putting time into this idea. They're putting resources into it. I think it's very clear that there are a lot of stakeholders who would be invested in a scientific project or scientific area on this topic. In terms of, the leadership science literature exists. It's been going on for a long time. But I do think that the developmental science literature has a lot to offer the current knowledge on leadership as well. And in particular, there are aspects of adolescent development that I think make it very, offers a lot of potential for our understanding of early leadership development. So we know that adolescence is a critical entry point into the world of work. So this is the developmental period where vocational interests are particularly coming online and crystallizing. Values as well. Value development is happening primarily in adolescence along with adolescent identity development. It's also, of course, the time when many individuals will get their first job of some sort and are applying to colleges and thinking about occupations and that sort of thing. In addition, the social hierarchy is highly salient in adolescent development. So social hierarchy formation is coming online very quickly as children move from middle childhood into puberty, and it's happening automatically. We were just talking about this earlier. So social hierarchy formation happens instantaneously, and it's highly consequential, which is relevant because it means that this is something that really matters to kids. They're really paying attention to it, and so scientifically we should be able to measure it very well if this is a highly salient process. A related point is that there's now a really sizable empirical literature suggesting that in adolescence, social sensitivity is higher than any other point in the lifespan. So it's consistent with this idea that when you're a teenager, what other people think about you is more important than it will ever be again, right? So you're paying attention to it, you're really good at it, you're hyper-attuned into whether you're being rejected or accepted, you're very attuned into who's the leader of the group or where people's positions are in these social hierarchies. And there are empirical literatures on all of these topics that I think have clear relevance for thinking about leadership, emergence, and development. So you probably can't read this in the back, which is fine. This is very much a work in progress, but I'm working on a review paper with a number of leadership researchers as co-authors, where we're trying to kind of pull all the relevant components of these literatures together. This is really a very descriptive paper right now. The idea is just basically, what does this adolescent leadership construct look like? You can think about it if we wanted to actually derive kind of an algorithm predicting adolescent leadership, what variables might go into that algorithm. And so there are a number of intrapersonal factors, personality traits, of course, things like social dominance and self-control. We might also put leadership motivations and goals in this category, as well as, of course, a number of cognitive and intellectual factors that are relevant for leadership development and effectiveness. There are a host of interpersonal factors as well, and there is some evidence from the adult leadership literature supporting these ideas, but this is where there's really a lot of adolescent development literature that speaks to these ideas of the development of social skills and perception. Peer influence is highly consequential in adolescence as well, related to these other aspects of social hierarchy formation and social sensitivity. And then social hierarchy and status, popularity, likability, all of these variables are likely relevant for thinking about who the leaders are at this age point. Certainly, we're at least starting thinking about them differently for girls and boys, and we're trying to look for potential gender differences that might emerge. It depends on who you talk to. Some people think this is the most important part of what we might be looking at, and others think that there won't be any, but it's an empirical question. And then once we've developed this idea of the adolescent leadership construct, how do we know if it's a real thing? Certainly we're going to look at the developmental stability. So if we can identify this sort of adolescent leadership space, is that stable over time? Does it predict relevant outcomes? It's an interesting question what those might be. So when you're thinking about early leaders, what are we actually trying to predict? What should these leaders be doing? What would our outcomes be? It's a bit different than when we're thinking about adult leaders in business settings or places where the external criteria that we're predicting might be a little more obvious. In kids and teenagers, it's a little less clear. And then, of course, through all this work, I'm trying to really make sure it maps on well to adult leadership research and understanding. It's one of the reasons I started with adolescence. It's actually kind of an older age range for me, so most of my research has been on the pubertal transition, kind of middle childhood to early adolescence, but it seemed to make a lot more sense to try and work backwards. So we have the adult leadership knowledge. Let's start with adolescence and try to provide some sort of mapping. Because the goal, of course, would be to think, can we identify some of these successful leaders much earlier in life? Who are these successful leaders before they're running their own company, before they're 25 or 30 or 40? So trying to map these concepts onto one another is a goal. So this is sort of where we're at. Like I said, we're working on a big review paper, pulling things together on this topic, but very open to comments or suggestions people might have about that framework. But then right away, as I mentioned, even though there's not much we know about this, right away I wanted to start collecting data. It was really clear that this was an area in need of study. People were really excited about it. So let's be the team that starts kind of mapping this out and collecting actual data to see what this looks like. What do these leaders look like? But where do you even start when you're creating kind of an entirely new research area that doesn't exist, an entirely new research topic? Well, I'm still not sure where to start. Maybe you have some ideas. But I thought we could kind of start with these really basic questions. The first one being, what does it even look like? What does adolescent leadership even look like? Does it look like it does in adults? In what ways is it similar? In what ways is it different? And then another question that I've just been interested in from the very beginning is this question about how leaders come to be. And this is one of the reasons I think studying leadership in early life has a lot of potential, because we can imagine that the social processes that are being employed to kind of detect leaders early in life are probably much simpler, much less complex than when we get into these large adult worlds that are nested in organizations and neighborhoods and life histories. So if we look at the way adolescents are actually selecting leaders, we might be able to drill down to kind of basic psychological processes of leadership identification that by the time you get into adults is just too complicated to really detect. So I've been really interested in this question of, I also think about it in terms of how do adolescents confer leadership status to one another? Like, we know you get 5 teenagers into a room who don't know each other, and within minutes, they are organized into a social hierarchy. We know this happens. We have a lot of evidence this happens. How does that happen? How do they decide? How do teenagers who don't even know each other confer this status to a stranger and let them kind of lead these groups? So that's another question. It's probably a little more downstream, but it's something that we were trying to get at with the data we've been collecting. Okay, so now I want to talk a little bit about our data and present a little bit of pilot data, but mostly tell you about some of the things we're doing to see if people might have any ideas of directions that we can move in with this work. So I started a study. This was a topic I wanted to work on before I got to Northwestern. And I got to Northwestern and I knew right away this was the project I wanted to start. So we started the Game Changer study. And in this study, we're collecting data from community adolescents. So just adolescents from the community. It's not a clinical sample. The data collection are currently ongoing, but we've run about 320 teenagers so far through the protocol. So the pilot data is in a reasonable state that I feel comfortable presenting it, showing it to you. We're hoping to get to maybe 450 or 500 kids. So I want it, because it's the first study like this, I want it to be a reasonably sized sample. We recruit teenagers between the ages of 13 and 17. They're very distributed across this, so they're real life teenagers. Half female, half male. The sample is somewhat ethnically diverse. It's a bit less diverse because it's on the north side of Chicago. Similar for socioeconomic status, it's a bit higher than we might expect if we were other parts of the city, but there's some diversity there as well. So for the study, we have teenagers come into the lab. It's a pretty long protocol. It takes them about 3.5 to 4 hours, and they do a lot of stuff. Because I was starting without even a research area to draw from. There are things from the adult leadership literature in there. There are things from the developmental literature. There are a lot of measures that we typically use in my lab anyway, adolescent personality kinds of measures. So they do a lot of questionnaires. Their parents fill out questionnaires about them as well. So we get self and parent report. We have some executive functioning tasks. We get a bit of their social media usage and peer relationships, some about extracurricular activities. The kids do a number of behavioral tasks when they're in the lab. So one of the approaches I like to use in studying personality is the thin slice approach, where you have kids go through specific situations, and those situational tasks are videotaped and then later coded for their personality characteristics based on this thin slice of their information. It's somewhat similar to assessment center-like data for those of you who are familiar with that in the IO side of things. So we have them do these personality situations. We also have them do some leadership-focused tasks, and I'll show you what one of those looks like to try and start figuring out if we can see something that's meaningful here. They do a social stress task, which I'll talk about. Try to get at things like person perception and social hierarchy. And then we measure a number of biomarkers. We get genetic data and hormonal data from hair and saliva samples. So they do a lot. And there's more than I even have here. We get values data, we get vocational interests. We're just trying to figure out if we can find something meaningful here in our adolescent leaders. So within these data, a lot of it is still being processed, and I'll show you some of the more complicated data. But one of the places it seemed reasonable to start was looking at leadership motivation, which is something we can probably measure a little more easily in teenagers. It gets a lot trickier to think about leadership skill and effectiveness in teenagers, although I would love to hear ideas about that. But this is kind of that first question of what does leadership even look like in teenagers? Can we even start to describe it? So one easy place to start is thinking about what we already know in terms of leadership strategies. So there's a fairly extensive literature in the adult leadership world on the different strategies people use to attain leadership positions or move up the social hierarchy. In particular, revolving around these two ideas of dominance and prestige, where dominant strategies are attaining leadership through coercion, through the use of fear and intimidation, a very punitive type of leadership as one way to move up the hierarchy. Also associated with things like hubristic or arrogant pride. Prestige strategies are moving up the hierarchy or trying to attain leadership status by earning the trust of others, by earning respect, by employing things like competency and expertise as ways to get people to follow, associated with pretty different things like authentic pride. And these seemed like a good place to start because there's a lot known about what they look like in adults, so we can at least draw a direct comparison with teenagers. Do these things look the same in teenagers as they do in adults? Do we find interesting differences? So our game changers filled out the Achievement Motivation Scale, which is a popular scale measuring these leadership strategies. So examples from the scale, dominance items are things like, I like talking to people who are important. I think I would enjoy having authority over other people. I like to give orders and get things going. Prestige motivations, I want to be an important person in the community. I really admire people who have fought their way to the top. If unemployment benefit was really high, I would still prefer to work. I like that one. It's like, yeah, I work for fun, not for money. But so you get a feel, right, for these kinds of motivational strategies. So it turns out that indeed, high schoolers from the community show a great range of differences in the way they endorse these items. So there are no issues with finding teenagers who score themselves as high in dominance motivation or low, and same for prestige. They're definitely drawing individual differences. And like you see in the adult literature, these scales are not particularly correlated with one another. They're pretty distinct motivational hierarchy movement strategies. So just some preliminary data for these dominance and prestige motivations in our teenagers. We can start by looking at their associations with the big five. And you see that both dominance and prestige motivation strategies, even though they're not correlated, they're both associated with high extroversion, high conscientiousness, and high openness to experience, which is pretty remarkable given that they're so low correlation between them. But then you see a clear divergence for the strategies for neuroticism and agreeableness, with our dominance motivated teenagers being very low in neuroticism, very emotionally stable, but very disagreeable. And then the prestige motivation adolescents, not really associated with neuroticism, but they're a little higher in agreeableness, right? So we see these interesting divergent profiles emerging. Some of the other scales we have, just for example, the interpersonal reactivity index is meant to be a social perception or empathy measure. And so we again see some differences. So the higher prestige motivation teenagers are higher in perspective taking, fantasy, and empathic concern, whereas the higher dominance motivation teenagers are just really, really low in personal distress. So a very emotionally stable group, which is similar to data that we have on these strategies in adults. I have some measures, some personality measures from the multidimensional personality questionnaire that the 5-factor model doesn't capture very well. We see that dominance motivations are super overlapping with social potency from the MPQ, so this is a very high social dominance kind of motivation, leadership motivation. Whereas prestige, you get a little bit of association with traditionalism from the MPQ. Traditionalism is a very value-laden personality scale, and it asks questions about preference for authority and preference for typical gender roles and things like that. Prestige motivations are a little bit negatively correlated with social dominance orientation. This is referring to preferences for economic distribution of resources, and this lower correlation index is a more kind of communal strategy. I prefer resources to be kind of distributed fairly across people, that sort of thing. And then our resistance to peer influence scale isn't really doing much with either of them. Okay, so clearly, we're already starting to see evidence that these leadership motivations are online in adolescence from the questionnaire data. We're continuing to explore that, which is an interesting avenue. We have a lot more things to look at, but what other data do we have? So one of the behavioral tasks that we use in this study was also drawn from the literature. It's called the leader-follower task. It's been used in the adult literature as a way to manipulate leadership role or status. So in the adult literature, undergraduate students typically would come into the lab and be assigned to either be a leader or a follower in this task. And it was shown to be somewhat effective at making people feel like a leader, but we were using it for a different purpose because we wanted to have some tasks in the lab where we could actually see how they might act as a leader to try and start getting a sense of skill or effectiveness. So the way the task works, it uses stimulus materials that probably a lot of you are familiar with from our standard Wechsler IQ batteries. So these are the block design stimulus materials from the WAIS and the WISC. But the way they're used in this task is our teenage participants come in and they're told that they're in the leadership position, and our leaders have the drawing that is supposed to be made from the blocks. They have a subordinate in the room who's sitting in front of them with the blocks, and the subordinate can't see the drawing. So the teenage participant stands behind the subordinate and has to verbally instruct them how to create the picture that they want to see in the material, right? So that's the way the task works. After the task, the subordinate, who's an RA from the lab or the follower, rates the person on a number of items. I'll show you in a minute in terms of how they were as a leader. But of course, we also are videotaping it with hopes of coding the data. And this is where very open to suggestions of what kinds of things we want to be looking at for measures of early leadership skill or effectiveness from these. It is making these people function so effectively in that role versus not. There are other little things like in the first two, which are examples of good or better leaders. They also employ this really interesting holistic strategy. I don't know if anyone picked up on that, where at the very beginning, they both started with the holistic instruction. The girl said, okay, put the 4 of them together in a square, right? So you're kind of like giving them a broad picture, and then you give the micro, and then the boy did something we've never seen in anyone else, where he was like, make a 2x2 grid. It was like, whoa, I don't know how fast. That's very smart, right? But so they're sort of like giving them meta instruction, and so there are all sorts of things we could potentially look at. After they finish the task, the follower fills out a questionnaire that we made up just to try to get us, like, what did it feel like you can see, right? So we're having people fill this out now just after watching it. You could fill it out because you can kind of feel like it's painful to be with these bad leaders. So we're having the followers fill this out immediately afterwards. I pulled out just a few of the items to show you here. So followers who reported that the teenager was leader-like or confident. These are teenagers who self-reported as more emotionally stable, more extroverted, and more open to experience. So this is also, cross-informant data. So these are pretty, even though the correlations are small, they're pretty meaningful. Clear instructions, did they give clear instructions? Isn't doing quite as much, but there's an association with open to experience. You get an interesting divergence for leader-like and confident, with leader-like being associated with higher self-reported conscientiousness, but not confident. And then you see associations for the anxious leaders, self-reported as more neurotic, introverted, lower on openness, and a little bit agreeable, right? So we see some interesting self-reported personality mapping on to this sort of leadership performance. Also interesting that most of the variance here is going on in open to experience. It is a pretty cognitively loaded task. It's literally stimulus material from an IQ test, so that may be part of why these openness traits are really playing a major role. So that is one thing we want to kind of covary for IQ, although I get concerned about doing that too, but that may be why openness to experience is really carrying the weight in how effective of a leader are you in this task. We also have the follower ratings also show different patterns for our leadership motivations. So particularly the teenagers who self-reported high dominance motivations, they were reported to be more leader-like, more confident, to give clear instructions, and to be much lower in anxiety in that leadership performance, which is consistent with our self-reported personalities, but it seems to actually manifest in those leadership tasks as well. They're perceived to also be more emotionally stable, right, when they're performing these leadership tasks, which is interesting, at least on initial impressions. Okay. So just to talk just briefly about some of our other data, I don't have analyses here, but just to show you what some of the tasks look like. The other major task we do is the Trier Social Stress Test. I don't know how familiar people are with this task. It's a task that's used to provoke HPA axis reactivity in the lab, so it's really reliable at spiking cortisol levels. And the basic component of it is a public speaking task that they do without warning in front of judges who are evaluating them, this sort of thing. So it's a stressful public speaking task. And we've used it in our lab a lot to measure cortisol reactivity and recovery, so how your hormones kind of respond to being stressed. But we tweaked it for this study. So here we're doing the Trier partially to stress them out, but we set it up as a competitive task. So the adolescents are told that they're going to participate in this public speaking task, and as part of this task, they'll be competing against all the other teenagers who are in the study, and they'll be evaluated and compared to these teenagers. So they do the Trier normally, but then after the Trier, there are a couple of add-ons. So after they perform the public speaking task, we put them in the eye tracker, and we have them watch other teenagers doing the task. So ostensibly their competition. So we have them watch their competition. These are same-sex peers who have been pre-selected to be high or low on social dominance. So they watch some who are really socially dominant and some who are not at all. And we then also present them with some forced choice stills. They watch the videos, and then they're presented with some forced choice stills where you're just doing a basic attentional task of these competitors. After that, we have them rate the teenagers they see for social dominance and a number of other traits. So we get their impressions of these teenagers they're watching. And we have them construct something like a social hierarchy where they rank order the people they just saw in terms of performance, and they include themselves in there. So we have them insert themselves in this kind of artificial social hierarchy to see where they put everyone, including themselves. So this is what it would look like after you perform this speaking task. You then sit in the eye tracker and you watch other teenagers perform the same task. So of course, we're hoping to get something interesting from the eye tracking data in terms of this question of like what cues they're using or what information they're using to confer leadership status. So when they do decide that somebody is successful or socially dominant or whatever it is, or extroverted, what are they paying attention to for those teenagers versus the others? We have them rate each person while they're still in the chair, so they rate them immediately before going to the next video, and all the videos are counterbalanced for order effects, all of that good stuff. And then at the end, this is the sort of social hierarchy, the attempt to measure the social hierarchy in a study where you only have one person. It's an interesting challenge. So this was the best I could come up with, where they have a picture of everyone they saw, they have a picture that's meant to represent themselves, and they give us some social hierarchy so we can see where they think they are, as well as kind of how they're positioning people and how that maps onto the things they were paying attention to in the eye tracker, sort of the idea. So we have a lot of questions with these data. It's still being processed, but at a basic level, we want to see how they're deciding who they prefer, or how we can predict which teenagers they are preferring. If the eye tracking data works out, we'd like to see if the socially dominant teens are actually exhibiting specific cues that are differentiating them from the others, perhaps things like paying more attention to their face versus their body. It may be something as simple as they just pay more attention to the socially dominant teens, whereas with the low dominance, they're kind of distracted and looking all over the place. We also, of course, have information on the raters themselves. So potentially we can see whether teenagers who are more dominance or prestige motivated pay attention to different things, use different cues when they're evaluating others, something I'd be interested in. Because the people they're rating were also in studies in the lab, we have a lot of information on them as well. So we have information on their levels of narcissism and personality, and can see how that plays out. Then eventually, hopefully, incorporating other aspects of this peer influence or social hierarchy information. We have data about their friends. We take screenshots of all of their social media profiles. The IRB wouldn't let us get access to the profiles, but we can have them log in the lab and open it up, and we can take a screenshot. So it's better than nothing. So that's what we'll start looking at soon, I think. So then that's really where we're at this point. As you can tell, it's very much a work in progress, kind of pushing forward on this theoretical integration, but then really spending a lot of time with the data, trying to just start thinking about what adolescent leaders look like in terms of motivation, relying on, at least now, the dominance prestige idea. Then really would love any ideas, either today or by email or anything people might have about what we could code from these videos, or what you, the experts, think might be interesting to start measuring in terms of leadership skill effectiveness, or things they might be paying attention to in this eye tracking component. We're also simultaneously starting a values-based intervention with, in combination with the Garage, which is a really interesting entrepreneurship model at Northwestern. It's a very competitive program where they select freshman entrepreneurs, and they're selected based on ideas they have, and they have teams, and we're working on a values-based intervention that we're trying to map onto some of our personality values data as well, and hoping to apply that down to teenagers. So that is where we are at. And I'd like to thank my lab members, including my children who think they're in my lab always. And just mention I'm starting a new blog that's really a space going to be focused on this adolescent leadership topic. In case you're interested or have feedback, I would definitely welcome that. So thank you very much. That's all I have.
How would you define leadership? And what are you expecting to see differences in leadership you would see in adulthood versus leadership in adolescence?
I think, so I'm kind of starting from my bias as a personality psychologist? I mean, it's a really good and kind of obvious question. Like, what do you mean by leadership, and how are you thinking about that? I started out on this work thinking about it, I think, in terms of social dominance. And it's my idea has certainly evolved and changed over time. But initially, I started out really kind of focusing on the personality trait that we might think of as social dominance or social potency. And I still don't think that's a bad place to start. I recognize that leadership is much broader than that, and we've been expanding since then. But I think initially that's a reasonable place to kind of start for me in terms of what it is. In terms of how it's different, I think the ways we measure it are going to be so different that it's not going to look the same. Even in terms of how do you measure leadership outside of a context? I mean, you can't really, but the context that adolescents are in are so different than the contexts that working adults, for example, are in. Yeah?
So, based on your research, do you see differences in the outcomes than you would see in research done on leadership in adult populations? So, like some of those relationships between dominance and extroversion and emotional stability, does that look similar to what leadership
So this is another funny thing. This is what happens when you start working in an area you know nothing about. This achievement motivation scale has been studied a lot in adult leadership research. It's never been correlated to the Big Five. I didn't know that because that's like an obvious place to start for me, so that's what I did. And then I called up my collaborator and was like, hey, so is this what it looks like in adults? And he was like, oh, no one's done that. I'm like, okay, that's you. We'll collect this. So we're collecting those data this year in adults that we can see. My guess is yes. Based on descriptions of those motivational styles in adults, I think it's going to be pretty similar. But I think this question of outcomes, it's a really hard question. It's a real challenge. Like, what is an outcome of an effective leader in high school? Like, what would we consider a successful outcome? Maybe it's even something like popularity, right? Like, you can imagine that like the consequential outcomes in high school might be different. So if we're really thinking about are these strategies or styles successful, we may be dealing with a different set of criteria than you would in adults. I don't know. I mean, it's an open question, but it's something I'm really struggling with right now. Welcome ideas. Yeah.
I was wondering if you have found that the stereotypes that apply to male and female leaders as adults also apply to adolescents. So, for example, female leaders are more likely to be viewed as bossy, whereas a male leader may be viewed as ambitious or something like that. Do you see similar patterns with adolescents?
It's a great question. I'm guessing yes. It's one of the things I want to start coding in the people who are watching the videos. Even preparing for the presentation, when I had some of my RAs go through to select some examples of good and bad videos for me to choose from, one of them came back and was like, all the bad examples are girls. And I was like, oh, okay, well, let's try to broaden our perspective, which to me suggests like, yes, these biases will also persist. But it would be an interesting thing to code for, right? To see. Do you have thoughts?
Well, it's just that that's pretty startling if those types of views occur that early on, because then, okay, well, that makes sense why people still continue to believe that about leaders when they get older.
I certainly expect it to be true. I mean, a lot of my work has been on relational aggression or mean girls behavior, which peaks at like age 12, which is the age period I'm most comfortable with. And mean girls behavior is very common in both girls and boys, and the social consequences of it are not the same, right? So the extent to which girls and boys are differentially punished versus rewarded for using these narcissistic and manipulative social strategies maps onto what you see in the adult gender differences leadership literature. So for sure it's already happening. Boys are rewarded for certain social strategies and girls are punished and ostracized for the same strategies. So I certainly think that'll play out here as well.
Kind of touching on that, I was fascinated with the language that the girl used, so a little bit more effective, because not only did she give positive feedback, but she also said please, and was very more critical and trying to get her way. And I'm curious if it is a result of kind of that bias of women are bossy when they are assertive, and so they change their language to avoid that.
Yeah, you see that a lot. The female leaders are much more use a lot more positive reinforcement. A lot. It's really evident. You also see a difference in the bad leaders. The female bad leaders apologize constantly, and like she was. I'm so sorry. I explained that horribly. You know, like this, like self-deprecate. Like so, there are definite language differences that I think we can measure.
You only work in one time, right?
Sorry.
Oh, two questions. One, do they know what they're coming in to do, the kids? Okay. Are they self kind of
Yeah.
Their leaders, or
I mean, you sort of worry about that and then you don't, because it's like, well, they are the ones I want to study, so maybe it's okay, you know? But so we spent a lot of time in the lab figuring out what flyer we wanted to use, because one of the things I wanted to really stay away from is us deciding what adolescent leaders look like ahead of time. Like, I really want this to be a descriptive, from the ground, and so I don't want to say like, oh, we just want to study these student council president people, right? And the idea that maybe leadership can take a lot of forms, especially early in life. So, we really try to like get pictures of kind of different types of leadership, like that could be indifferent. We have like the nerdy science kid, like a lot of us, right? Like you can be a little science leader, and that looks very different than like the United Nations person, or you have all these different. So, it is called the Game Changer Study. It's clear that that's kind of what we're studying, but we've tried to cast a wide net. I don't know how much, I will say that a lot of the parents when we recruit through the parents, it's through this process of parents being like, oh, you definitely need to study my kids. Okay. Great, bring them in. Right? My son is perfect for this study. You need him. Okay.
You had mentioned that you did a survey of the parents as well. Did you notice any differences between what the kid would say about themselves and their parents, and how did that affect what you're studying?
Yeah, we just started looking at those data, which I was really interested in. So, for example, and we barely started, but we get a lot of the same measures from the parents. One of the ones I wanted to start with was the parents' report on that empathy measure in terms of how it maps onto follower ratings, because I imagine a lot of this is probably not a great candidate for self-report for obvious reasons. So if the kid says, I'm super empathic, that could be a lot of things, right? And so parents' ratings of the teenagers' empathy does correlate with their performance in the leadership tasks. Like the kids whose parents say are more empathic and take the perspective of others do better in that task according to the followers. But I do think that parent data is going to be really valuable.
So you're working in describing kind of what leadership looks like in adolescence. How are you going about doing that to define what successful leadership looks like in adolescence? So like you said, you don't want to focus on just the president, or maybe it's the football captain or volleyball captain or whatever. Are you looking at examples of good leadership to define what leadership looks like in adolescence versus
Yeah, so the real answer is, this is what we're trying to figure out. So we're trying to come at it from a lot of different angles, because I don't think there's an easy answer to that question. One of the other side projects we started doing was identifying super well identified, like super well known adolescent leaders, like famous teenagers, basically, right? Who started a nonprofit and are saving the world, or like, because there are those sorts of cases, and so I would describe that as sort of working backwards. And so we are trying to do that as well, to describe the personality characteristics of those clearly successful leaders.
Maybe not the correlates, but like what their behaviors look like. Like what is a successful?
Well, don't you think that's task specific? I don't know. What do you think?
Situational specificity.
I think that's sort of the question, is like, are they using different strategies? One of the reasons we're keeping things pretty simple here is because it at least does constrain within task, right? So we have them all in the same task, and then we have them in the same task again, and they're watching other kids do the exact same task they just did. So we're starting very small, but the advantages of that is it really does constrain to get around at least some of that. But I imagine it's very, very complex, you know. I mean, I think the eye tracking component is getting at what I see as like this super fundamental basic process, which is just like, you're in a group of people you don't know, you figure out who the leader is in 30 seconds. What is that about? Like, how does that happen, right? That's a place to start. Like, how you're making that decision.
I have a question on that, actually, because it stuck out to me. To what degree do you think biological factors are taking into consideration with that? And I'm thinking at this age, everyone's hormones come online, scents come online, kind of sexual fitness starts coming into play. So do you think it maybe even scent is a factor into, hey, you're the leader, you're this, and everyone can kind of rank each other from that standpoint?
Potentially. I mean, we definitely constrained the task to same sex for a reason. So girls are just comparing themselves to girls and boys to boys to control for that a little bit. We also do have a lot of hormonal data on these kids, both the kids they're watching and the kids who are participating in this version, as well as things like pubertal status. And so certainly we can look at how some of those things map on to levels of social dominance or position in peer group or that sort of thing.
Were you collecting information on birth order or presence or absence of siblings growing up?
We have that information.
Are you studying it, or is it?
And well, it's so hard to do it in samples this small because, yeah, I think it's just way too underpowered to find enough, you know, meaningful differences in the birth orders that there are. But we do have it. We definitely.
I feel like you can hypothesize it either way, right? Like the only child could be considered the leader because they're always seen as such, and yet there's leader emergence in large groups trying to just take control of the siblings of 8 or something like that.
Yeah, it's a good point, and we do have the data. I would just be scared to do analysis on it, and so just I think it would be capitalizing on chance, but potentially.
Are you measuring oxytocin?
No.
That would be related to like increased trustee strategies or frequency.
Like the interpersonal perception part, or?
Maybe, perhaps. I know like Paul Beck has a lot of literature around oxytocin and even inducing it when there's something like that with trust and leadership, like organizational trust and such.
Yeah, we don't do oxytocin. So I do the sex hormones for obvious reasons because I'm interested in externalizing and because they're, you know, in the later stages of puberty. Right. So we get testosterone and estradiol, and then all the stress hormones, which is something I'm actually really interested in looking at in terms of how that maps onto leadership effectiveness and skill in that task. You know, if you get really stressed out, like is there a moderately adaptive level of stress, or are the ones who are good at it showing really fast recovery, like they get appropriately stressed but then they recover quickly? So I am interested in looking at that, but haven't yet.
Are you interested in like long term, so if you were to identify these people, maybe are likely adolescent leaders, do they actually follow through in terms of leadership later in life?
Yes. Yeah, we're going to follow up with them. So I've been collecting the data for so long now that a lot of them are not adolescents anymore, which means they're a lot easier to collect data on because they don't have to go through their parents. So a lot of them are already adults,
So
18, 19.
Is that part of the study that they signed up for?
Yeah, we told them that we'll be following up longitudinally. So yes, I definitely want to look at like how they're doing in college or in jobs, or like what's going on in their lives and what are intimate relationships. I can ask them lots of things now that they're grown-ups. It's so much easier. So much easier. So yes.
So are all of the tasks that you need to do, are they all more along the logical side, or are there any that are more physical? And do you do them with teams too, or just that?
Love to. What do you mean by physical?
More of like, let's say you have a team together and you have to build something. That's less on the logical side and more of like, I think to me the reason I'm asking is because you would have a leader kind of evolve in different levels. Like if you have somebody who's really strong, they might come out as a leader, or somebody who's like, hey, I'm a planner, and then they come out as a leader in that situation. Yeah, no, I don't have any group-based data. I would love to have group-based data. It's so hard to collect, especially, I mean, even in a city as big as Chicago, you run into issues of acquaintanceship differences, right? So you try to get a group in who don't know each other at all, and that's really complicated, and can they come in at the same time? We deal with a lot of scheduling constraints around the hormones as well, like females have to be at this specific stage of their cycle, and
So I would love to do it, but it's really hard data to collect. And even if I was able to go into a school and do it, which is probably most feasible, the acquaintanceship stuff, and there's so much, I feel like there's so many previously held ideas about status and social hierarchy in any group who knows each other, reputation. So it would be really messy. If I could find the right design, I would definitely do it. Because I think that's that kind of group emergence is where it would be really cool to see what's happening someday.
Well, but I do wonder about the task a little bit, right? So the task that our colleague suggested is is a building task, but even this one's visual spatial, and your RA's comment that all of the bad leaders were female. Like, well, I mean, this task. Well, first of all, it's a task, like a specific. And there's a lot of research on task-oriented versus people-oriented leadership and things like that. And there's reasons to think that sex would be related with that.
Sure.
And the same, and I do wonder about also the specific task that is the visual spatial. And it made me also wonder if you have an IQ measure by any chance.
I just get proxies. I have 3 measures, executive functioning measures.
No, that's terrible.
I mean, from IQ back from the waist though.
I know
They're from the waist.
I know what you mean, but it's not. But I mean, by be terrible, I mean it's not covering the.
Yeah, no. I just
you know what I mean? The mental rotations
executive
kind of stuff. Yeah.
But this task, this IQ task, does not show gender differences. So, for what it's worth. Block
particular
design.
task.
Like actually performing the task. There are
I
no
got
gender
you.
differences.
Okay. Well, in any case, I wonder if it was a task that was more people oriented kind of task.
Yeah, it's an interesting question.
I don't know.
Like resolving a conflict.
Yeah, or something like that. I wonder if you would see a big difference in the performance from that standpoint.
Yeah, it's really interesting.
Yeah.
Especially considering like sometimes we get like as you're being promoted throughout the organization, there's usually a time where you switch from more of a tactical to more of a strategic role in an organization. So going from more of a managerial role to more of a leadership role. So it'd be interesting to see some of that where it's less about the tactical and more about like strategically thinking about people in general.
Oh, interesting. Yeah, these are the things I need to read about, learn about. Thank you so much. I really appreciate the feedback.
So thanks everyone. There's probably, I don't know if there's any cookies left, but